Hello, everyone, and welcome to Secular Soapbox on Promethean Secular Frontier. This is a show where we have strong opinions, always from a secular perspective, and we love to share them. I'm your host, Bryce Aroni, and I am here with co-host Caleb. What's going on, buddy? You are muted if you are trying to talk.
There we go.
There you go. What's
About
going
that,
on, buddy?
Yeah. No, it's another day in paradise. I'm really looking forward to this one. As always, man, this is just a nice break in the pace for me, and I always look forward to these.
Well, I hope you're ready to go nuclear here, because today we are definitely going nuclear. And cue the mushroom cloud graphic. Wait, we don't. No, we don't have a mushroom cloud graphic. Do we have any stock footage from the movie Terminator 2? Wait, no, nothing? You got to be kidding me. Well, I'm sorry about that. We don't have any footage of the going nuclear part, but we do have a nuclear scientist. Dr. Ben Davis is here with us, and he was kind enough to drop by Secular Soapbox to talk about the benefits of nuclear energy. And for those of you who may not know, Dr. Ben, as he likes to be called, has a master's degree in nuclear astrophysics and a PhD in nuclear physics from the University of Notre Dame. I hope I said that right. I like to say Notre Dame, but I think that's the way it's pronounced in Paris and in France.
It's considered you're churching it up if you say Notre Dame here. It's Notre Dame.
It's Notre Dame. There you go. So in addition to you're also a professor, aren't you? You're a professor at ECPI University in Greenville, South Carolina.
That's correct.
What is ECPI? What does that stand for?
Well, 480 years ago, when they founded the university, it used to stand for East Coast Polytechnic Institute.
Got it.
And now it stands for something stupid, like excellence, professionalism. I don't know.
Hey, all of those things are good, but you are a professor there, and you're into software development, including robotic electronics from your bio. So what exactly do you profess?
What do I profess about what?
What?
In your lectures, what are you professing?
Like tonight, I'm actually technically in class right now. We run 5-hour classes, which I don't know why anybody thinks that's a good idea, but
no, that's
technically
horrible.
In class right now. And right now I'm teaching circuits 110. So basic electrical circuits. I have been known to teach robotics. I have been known to teach PLC programming, which is an industrial controller type thing. Tomorrow I'll be teaching math, so that's fun.
So multifaceted, therefore.
Definitely multifaceted. And last term I was teaching physics. So
wow.
I still get to go home to mama every now and then and teach a physics class.
So it sounds like you're kind of an all-around scientist, because you're into astronomy, physics, mathematics, computers, and electronics. That sounds like that's damn near all of the sciences.
It's
There's
kind of
the important
my
ones.
whole career was like that. I got my PhD in nuclear physics, couldn't find a job, and so promptly I did a stint as a professor for a couple of years when I first got out of grad school. But quickly reinvented myself as a software developer, where I made most of my money so that I could become semi-retired and be a professor again, and kind of.
Why does somebody become a major in nuclear physics?
Why not?
Well,
No, I'm just curious. What was your goal?
Originally, like many 18-year-olds, I went to college. I didn't know what I wanted to be. It's kind of funny the way things work out sometimes. And I remember 2 years in, well, I'll tell you this story first. I got out of high school, and I was always liked to tinker. I always had the Radio Shack kits and stuff like that, build electronic kits. And I wanted a computer. So this was 1983, just to set the stage for you. And so I wanted a computer, and my parents were like, no, that's a waste of money, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, I really want a computer. I want one of computers. And so I graduated from high school, and all the relatives sent me $5, $10 check, whatever. Congratulations. Fuck off. Here's $5, go away. and I had about $300. And so I went to my parents and I said, I need a computer. I want a Radio Shack color computer and I want a color TV, because that was the monitor for the thing, right? You had to have both to be able to use it. And my parents were like, well, we're not spending that kind of, because they offered, they said, well, whatever you want, we'll double whatever everybody else gave you. And I said, you know, color TV is about $300. This Radio Shack color computer is $300. So I need both of those. And they said, well, we're not wasting our money on a toy, but they could see the value in me having a color TV. So they bought me the TV.
Wow.
And I went out and took my graduation money and bought a Radio Shack color computer, taught myself to program that summer between high school and college. And it not only taught me how to program, but it sort of taught me logic. It solidified a lot of ideas in my mind. Suddenly, I was a C student in high school, but suddenly when I taught myself to program and actually make this machine work the way that I wanted it to work, it taught me a lot about logic. It taught me a lot about math. It just made me a better thinker. And so I went to college, and suddenly physics was easy, and I really liked it, because general physics, I was, you know, learning about, you know, how a submarine goes underwater and comes back up, or how a rocket goes into space, and, you know, our electronic circuits, and how, you know, what a resistor is and why it does what it does. And so I enjoyed all of that. And so hence I enjoyed physics. So, okay, now we fast forward 2 years in. I'm doing pretty good in college, which my parents are thrilled about. And I went to my advisor and I went to my parents. I had the conversation separately with both of them. And I said, kind of good at this computer programming thing, and I'm kind of good at physics. And I mean, obviously I'm good at math too, but I don't want to be a mathematician. But I'm not sure what I want to major in. And so both my advisor at college and double majors were kind of rare back then. A few people did it, but you didn't normally double major in anything. But both my parents and my advisor said, well, you know, those computers, they're still kind of like toys. They're a fad. They'll go away. So
What year was this again?
Pardon me?
What year was this?
This would have been, say, 85. This would have been 2 years in.
Okay.
So I graduated high school in 83. This would have been like 1985. And my parents were like, you know, those are just toys for people to play games on. If you can learn a hard science and be good at it, that's what you need to do. And so, okay, fine. I majored in physics. I don't feel bad about that decision, by the way.
And just to bolster kind of your story a little bit, because that might be hard for some people to believe nowadays in the age of computers. But in 1985, I got my first computer, and it was a Commodore VIC-20, and it was a toy. Like, I literally used it for games, and that's all anyone thought that you could do with computers back then. So this totally makes sense to me. But
and
1985,
fair, you know, they were marketed that way. I mean, you know, the Commodore 64, the VIC-20, and the color computer all had game ports, so you could plug these little modules in and run these games without ever having to know how to program.
right?
So they were sort of the first gaming consoles, as well as, you know, the first computers, first personal computers. So yeah, anyway, I got a bachelor's degree in physics. And what do you do with a bachelor's degree in physics? You go to grad school. It's not like you can go out and get a job with a BS in physics. So I went to grad school. I made it into Notre Dame. And then it just really became a choice of what I thought was the interesting science, plus which advisor I liked the most, right? So, you know, the nuclear astrophysics guy was a cool advisor. You know, so I got my master's with him, and then I changed advisors and went straight nuclear. But it's not like I ever grew up going, I want to be a nuclear physicist. I could have just easily been a atomic physics or a solid state physicist. You know, I could have been any number of things, just depending on where I went to grad school and who I talked to on that day when I was in the right mood.
Sure.
You know, but just turned out to be nuclear physics.
And certainly you found it interesting enough to stay with it and become our resident expert on nuclear technology and nuclear energy, which we'll get into a little bit later. But first, I I made a joke at the opening where I referenced Terminator 2. And I suspect this is a movie that you've probably seen because I read in your bio that you're into science fiction. So let me just ask you about that first. What type of science fiction are you into, and how did you develop an interest in that? And I guess maybe the second part of the question is, was your interest in science fiction, did that influence your desire to get into nuclear physics, or vice versa, or none of the above?
It's funny, you ask me these questions and you think they ought to have a simple answer, and then I go back to childhood and think about everything, and it's like, well, that's not a simple answer. I can remember when I was in first grade, I wanted to be an astronaut, but I was overweight and had poor eyesight, and I was never going to be an astronaut. As a matter of fact, if I remember right, they killed the Apollo program in 1972. And so I would have been all of 8. So the odds of me ever becoming an astronaut, even as a kid, I realized were probably pretty slim. So then I wanted to be a fighter pilot. But again, the poor eyesight, the poor, not being physical, not being athletic, that wasn't going to work for me. So then I sort of said, I want to be a scientist. And so I tinkered with, like I say, electronics kits. I had a chemistry lab, which I don't think they sell anymore. I think the lawyers have ruined that, and kids can't buy chemistry sets anymore, which is
really,
I think,
because I had one when I was a kid. That actually makes me quite sad.
It's something people don't even realize, because they were just sort of quietly taken off the market, and people didn't even, notice or say anything about it. But I guess it was I should know because I just saw a thing on my Facebook page, a reminder about it. But I guess it was about 3 years ago. I always liked blowing things up when I was a kid, and I always I had to go with the sulfur and the chemistry set and grind my own coal and do all this stuff. And
make it so good.
I had less than stellar results. So now here I am, 50 years later going, you know what? I'm going to take another run at this. And so I actually did, for the cons, I actually did a presentation, The Science of Explosives. Dr. Ben blows shit up, right? And I went out, I invested all this money. I bought all this stuff to make different pyrotechnics and explosives. And I started by looking for just a regular run-of-the-mill chemistry set, and that's when I discovered that they don't sell those anymore.
Wow.
They're just not out there. So what was the original question?
It was about science fiction, and I guess it was sort of a half-assed question because I added in a bunch of other stuff. So let me ask a more specific question. As far as science fiction goes, what would you say are your favorites? And you can pick from TV series, movies. I'm trying to get a gauge of like what kind of science fiction you're into.
Well, I mean, I could be trite and say Star Trek. I grew up on Star Trek, right?
There you go.
So that would be a start.
Don't know if you can see that. That's on there.
Nice. I see it. The phaser.
Phaser.
Old school phaser.
Yep.
As far as reading goes, I was more of an Isaac Asimov fan. And then since I basically dated myself and told you how old I am, then we also, one of the things that, I've always thought was striking, and, most people don't realize it, but when you talk about your favorite movie or your favorite book or your favorite song, it's usually something that came out when you were an early teenager, when you were coming of age. And when you think about it, it's not really that hard to realize why. You just, at that point in your life, you had just started to sort of understand the world around you. You've learned basic communications, how to cope, that kind of thing. And you're starting to notice, the extra stuff, the stuff with entertainment value, the stuff that's part of the culture now. And so that's what sticks with you. So I do one podcast where they always lead me in with Boston, because Boston's my favorite band,
Oh,
most people
I thought you were talking about the city for a moment.
That's trite and silly. No, the rock group. But the other thing that happened was around 1977, there was a movie that came out, and it was like no other movie I'd ever seen before.
That's on here as well.
Yep.
That's the Death Star.
So Star Wars had a big impact on me because I was at just the right age when it came out. And like I say, there was literally nothing like it that came before it. Not in my mind, and not in my experience. I'm sure somebody could write in and say, "What about blah blah blah?" It's like, no. For me, I'd never seen anything like it before, with the special effects and the big storyline that went on until I was a senior. Return of the Jedi. I was a senior in high school, but I
So
couldn't
I'm
wait for the
glad
next movie to come out.
I am glad to hear you say that you're a fan of both, because I'm a huge fan of both. But one of my favorite movies growing up was Back to the Future. And if you know anything about that movie, Doc Brown, he uses plutonium to power the DeLorean. And then Marty McFly, when he realizes this, he says, "Are you telling me that this sucker is nuclear?" And that's probably the first time I ever heard the word nuclear or understood it. But it was framed in a negative context. The beginning of that movie opens up, he's stolen plutonium, and then Marty
From
McFly
terrorists, because it's only terrorists that have plutonium, right?
Correct. It was from the terror, and terrorists needed plutonium to make nuclear weapons. And then Marty's like, "This is nuclear." And so I knew nuclear was bad from when I was a kid. I didn't know what that meant or why it was bad, but I got the sense from movies and television that the word nuclear was associated with bad things. So you are here to kind of educate us a little bit about what nuclear means and why it's good, or at least why attempting to derive energy from it is good. So I guess the question is, how does nuclear power work? Can you give us like a basic crash course on that? And I'll just give you a starting point. I consider myself a layman. My basic understanding of the way that nuclear power works, and correct me if I'm wrong, is plutonium rods heat up water, which produces steam, which turns turbines, which generate electrical power. And that's all I know.
Okay. So none of that is particularly helpful for the conversation that I think we're about to have.
Okay.
But you remember the standard picture of the atom. You've got the nucleus, which is really, really dense and really, really concentrated. And you've got these electrons orbiting around the nucleus.
And the nucleus has protons and neutrons. Is that correct?
The nucleus has protons and neutrons. That's correct. And then you have the electrons in these orbits around it, right?
Yep.
And so when you do chemistry, when you make a molecule, when you blow something up, right, you are basically taking, say, this oxygen atom and this carbon atom, and you're putting them together and you're making them share electron orbits. And so you're exchanging this binding energy for external energy. And you do the same thing when you burn gasoline, right? Or anything else, propane, natural gas, whatever. That's chemistry. And so you don't have to know what an electron volt is, but I'm going to throw a number out there. Typically, your typical chemical reaction gives off 1 electron volt of energy if it's an exothermic reaction. That's the order of magnitude, right? They're all different. Now, nuclear energy is when you start manipulating things inside the nucleus of the atom, which are much more densely packed. They're much more tightly bound together. So you take the nucleus of the atom, or you split it apart, or maybe you combine 2 nuclei to make an even more tightly bound, larger nucleus. That's fusion. And you get about 1 million electron volts of energy released when you manipulate at that level. So
splitting them apart is fission. Is that right?
That's right. Splitting them apart is fission, and every nuclear power plant that works that we're going to talk about is still using fission. That's still a fission reaction. Fusion is not something we've been able to do.
I hear about it in science fiction all the time, so it sounds like it's a real thing, but in reality, we don't have that yet, right?
Well, the running joke among everybody in the industry is, fusion is always 15 years away. When you ask somebody in 1950 when we were going to have fusion power, they say in about 15 years. And when you ask somebody today when we're going to have fusion power, they'll say in about 15 years. Technically, it's very, very hard to do. And every time they think they make inroads with it and start to actually make real progress with it, they hit some snag, and they're not any further down the road than they started with. So it's just really, really hard to do fusion. You're trying to emulate or replicate the pressures and temperatures inside a star to make a fusion reaction go, and you're trying to sustain that. And it's just damn hard to do, on the planet Earth, because you don't have that kind of gravity to play with.
So right now we have fission-based nuclear power. What exactly is... Uh-oh. Sorry, the dog. There you go.
I have a couple of words myself.
I do too, but they know better than that. So I think what I was about to ask was fission, splitting atoms and deriving nuclear energy from that. What is the prevalence of that worldwide? Like, how many countries make use of nuclear power? Is it a lot, a little, the majority, a minority, or do you know?
I wouldn't want to say with any confidence a worldwide number. It's about 20% here in the United States of all the power that's generated. France is famous for being very heavily nuclear based.
That's right.
The numbers I typically hear now, environmentalists for whatever reasons don't like nuclear power. And so the French and the Germans are sort of trying to walk back from the nuclear power and go with solar and stuff like that. But as far as I know, France still runs about 75% nuclear power. And then you go out to Asia, and those guys don't, well, there's reasons for this. There's 1.2 billion people on the planet that don't have electricity at all. And if you don't have electricity, we take it for granted, but you can't better yourself. You can't read books at night because you're sitting in the dark. You're not going to read a book by candlelight. So it's not like you're going to go to night class and better yourself, or, buy a washing machine and free up, having to walk down to the creek bed and wash your clothes by hand. Just simple things that we take for granted. When you don't have electricity, you don't get. And so there's still 1.2 billion people on this planet that don't have electricity, and they want it, and they're going to do whatever they have to get it. So when you look at India and China, they are not, worried about the environmental aspects of this at all. They've got something that works, they're going to use it. And you could say you hate nuclear power here, and that's fine, but I guarantee you the Chinese are going to be building reactors. And I don't know what the percentages are, but I would guess that in Asia, it's probably at least 35%. Just saying that U.S. is 20%. In Asia, it's probably 30-35% and rising, depending on.
So why is it only 20% here? Like, why is our reliance or utilization of nuclear energy so much lower relative to these other places? Why don't we use it more?
Because we're afraid of it. For some of the things that you've already mentioned. Unfortunately, the unfortunate thing about science fiction and a lot of movies or, literature is that you take something that's kind of mysterious and unknown, and that becomes the plot for your movie or your book.
Yeah.
And so, Frankenstein was written when electricity was something that wasn't well understood. And so Dr. Frankenstein makes the monster by, energizing it with the electricity and a lightning bolt. And people somehow thought that was credible because they didn't understand electricity. And they thought, yeah, we're going to make, start playing with this electricity too much, we're going to make monsters. It's
Right.
that soccer mom mentality of, if it's new and different, I must be afraid of it. But the funny thing about that as a scientist is, fear doesn't get you anywhere. That's the thing that bugs me about that. Everything we do is going to be increasing orders of magnitude of power and energy, and there's going to be danger associated with it. But I don't know about you, but I don't want to go back to living in a cave, so I still want to have the house with the air conditioning and heating in the winter and lights at night and all that stuff, streaming videos, so I'd go home and watch TV and all that stuff.
I mean, I blame a lot of it on education and or lack thereof, really, because I remember I keep going back to when I was a kid, and I keep going back to this Terminator 2 reference because I saw that movie when I was a kid in theaters. And do you remember the nightmare scene where Sarah Connor is envisioning the nuclear holocaust and everything gets set ablaze? Well, that scene gave me nightmares when I was a kid, you know?
Of course.
And I think that there was this idea, at least for me going up, that nuclear power and nuclear weapons were related to each other. And, you know, the word nuclear conjures nuclear mushroom clouds.
And that's the other problem is nuclear weapons are conflated with nuclear power. And, you know, it's just like chemistry and explosives. You don't have to blow things up. You don't have to use this knowledge destructively. Nobody says you have to use it that way. You know? And it's better if you don't use it that way. But
so when I think of the dangers of nuclear power, the thing that comes to my brain is radiation, just the word. Given the danger of radiation from nuclear sources, what would you have to say to ease a layman like myself that might be concerned about such things?
Well, one of the things that people seem to miss, even though every nuclear physicist says it every time the topic comes up, is that everybody thinks radiation is something man-made, or it's only a problem when we mess with it, but there's naturally occurring radiation.
Yeah.
And you can live by a nuclear power plant your whole life and get less radiation, immeasurable. It's not even, it's so tiny you can't even measure it. Get way less radiation than you would if you got in an airplane and you flew from New York to LA. Because you go to that higher altitude and you get all these cosmic rays bombarding you in the airplane at 35,000 feet. And nobody thinks twice about getting on an airplane. So people want to be afraid of something until they've got a shown benefit in it, like getting in an airplane and flying to the West Coast. And then suddenly they're not as afraid of it anymore. It's like, oh, well, I want to do that, so I guess I won't be afraid of it.
Yeah, that makes a really good analogy, because I've made that trip. I mean, I've driven from Indianapolis to Vegas and LA, just that single trip, a lot growing up, because I grew up in a split home cross country. So I've made that trip a lot. So it sounds to me like I've had more exposure to radiation than somebody that might live 10, 15, 20 miles from a nuclear power plant.
You absolutely have. It's documentable. I mean, it's provable mathematically, however you want to say it.
And of course, your exposure to radiation varies by occupation as well, right? Because I used to be in the military where I worked on radio equipment and radar equipment that I was exposed to RF radiation all the time, and so that just came with the territory. And so people in different career paths will find themselves being more exposed. You talked about flying on the airlines. Pilots, obviously, they're flying all the time, and other aircrew members, flight attendants, they're constantly getting exposed. I think the other thing that we would probably want to point out is that not all nuclear power plants are created equally. And radiation shielding and safety measures, these are things that are all variable depending on the construction and the safety protocols that are in place. I think a lot of people think back to Chernobyl, which is kind of before Caleb's time anyway. I don't even remember. What year was that? Did you recall?
1986.
Yeah. When were you born, Caleb?
90.
Yeah, there you go. So before you were born, but I was a kid too. Chernobyl, was basically, which is in Ukraine, by the way, and is in the news today for fears of, that there could be radiation leaking. Kind of a side
started on that, because I'll be on a rant all night. I'll be on a rant for the next 30 minutes if we get started on that.
Well, we may start you off on that as one of our final questions and see how far it takes us.
Yeah, let's make a note so that we can at least get some keynotes here, because I'm interested.
Well, one thing's for sure. It doesn't matter how big of a piece of shit you are. You probably haven't killed 10,000 people and left another 2 million homeless. So you're probably not the depth of shitheadedness on the planet right now.
talking about Putin, I imagine. But when we look at nuclear power plants, like, and you look specifically at the disasters at Chernobyl, I think the Fukushima plant in Japan was damaged by a massive earthquake that triggered a tsunami.
Tsunami that did most of the damage in that
tsunami did damage it. And so maybe the lesson learned there is don't build a nuclear reactor on an active fault line where you're on an island that could be destroyed by a tsunami, and maybe don't trust, the Soviet government at the time to manage nuclear power plants. But France doesn't seem to have this problem.
Isn't that funny? That the one nation that's famous for, making the most nuclear power plants, and using it the most, have never had a problem like this. Not anything even close.
And I think one of the other arguments that I can think of that I'm not sure is a very good argument is the fact that nuclear waste and nuclear waste disposal and management, that people are afraid that it would damage the environment. But is that really of concern? Because France, they recycle their nuclear power, don't they?
Okay. Here's what pisses me off. All right. Now, before I even start, I need to put this disclaimer in there. Okay. That yes, I'm a nuclear physicist, but I've never worked for the nuclear power industry. I worked at GE for a while. I made gas turbines. I wrote the software for them. But I've never worked for the nuclear industry. Whether you're worried about global warming or not, have at it. I'll be dead before it's an issue for me. And so I have no axe to grind here, right? When I start talking about nuclear power and I sound like maybe some kind of shill for the industry or whatever, no, I've never made the first dollar off of nuclear power.
You have no dog in the fight.
For that matter. And so I don't have a dog in that fight other than to just talk about logically what's going on. So now let's back up and talk about the waste. And we did this on a previous show, but it's worth mentioning again. For me, when I talk about being green and doing what's right for the planet and still, being able to enjoy my own life in the process, I ask, how much waste do I generate? And so when you're talking about nuclear power, for my personal share of electricity that I consume, which I'm going to presume is average, even though I work really hard to have efficient lighting and efficient air conditioning and things like that in my house. But if I'm average, 3 M&Ms worth of nuclear waste per year. So if I ask myself, if I live 100 years, how much, and I was personally responsible for disposing of that waste, what would I have to do at the end of that 100 years? Well, I'd have 300 M&Ms. You could bury that in my coffin with me,
Yeah.
And I would dispose of the waste that I was responsible for generating. There is no other industry that you can even come close to doing that with.
It's kind of a ridiculous argument, isn't it? Especially when you juxtapose that with how much damage the burning of fossil fuels does to the environment. If people are concerned about the environment, we can't do nuclear because the waste. Well, what about all of the waste that goes?
Other thing that's, infuriating about it for me is that, we want to demonize this industry for nuclear waste, yet it's the only industry that self-contains its waste. People seem to think that, spewing, coal ash into the sky or smoke from oil, because we're supposed to be talking about oil, right, into the sky, not to mention the waste products, the ash and the material that doesn't burn.
Hang on for a second before you go on. Oh, never mind. He already did it. I was about to pull up that comment. So this is kind of speaks to what we're talking to, comparing the benefits and disadvantages of nuclear power. I'm assuming we're comparing it to the type of power that we're generating now, but go on.
Right. So, yeah, I think we're sort of getting to that. We're getting around to that. But we want to demonize this industry that actually self-contains its own waste, and none of the others do it. And it's so much smaller. If you take all of the nuclear waste in the United States, I've read that it's about the size of a football field, about 50 feet deep. That sounds like a lot, but that is less than one ash pond in a coal burning plant. And that's not counting the smoke. That's not counting the stuff we're throwing into the air. People act like, nuclear power isn't a viable option. It's the only option if you're concerned about global warming. It's the only thing that's going to save this planet, if you consider that to be a real problem. Now, if you don't consider it to be a real problem, that's a different discussion. But you're probably pro-nuclear anyway. But it is the most advanced thing. And we're back to that discussion about 1 electron volt per reaction versus 1 million electron volts per reaction. The reason that there's less waste is because of that energy density. I like to say, if you walk around with $1 in your pocket, you can't even buy a cup of coffee. If you walk around with $1 million in pocket, you can buy whatever the hell you want. And so you're using a lot less material to get the energy you need to power everybody's house. And yes, you do have to be careful about how you dispose of it, but there's a whole lot less of it to worry about disposing, and none of it's going into the atmosphere and adding to the greenhouse problem.
Yeah. And I think people forget that, how much CO2 and methane we produce in the atmosphere, that the greenhouse gases, CO2 emissions from vehicles and from aircraft and from pretty much anything else that uses petroleum, not to mention the coal. It's weird to say that in 2022 we're still burning coal, but I mean,
well, those 1.2 billion people that don't have electricity, they burn dung. That's how they stay warm at night.
Right, and which contributes to methane.
Way more health problems associated with them than coal even.
Right. So it seems like the benefits, clearly the reduction in atmospheric waste and the emission of greenhouse gases is a benefit to nuclear power over the burning of fossil fuels. And also it's more efficient, right? You get more bang for your buck. You get more energy.
Well, those are buckets in a well, they're peas in a pod. The higher the efficiency, the less waste you're going to have. The less things you don't want if you bring up your efficiency. And, again, nuclear power is orders of magnitude more efficient, in terms of the amount of fuel you have to use to get the amount of electricity that you need.
Yeah. I don't know if you would know the answer to this offhand, but it's something to ponder anyway. I'm wondering, do you think that there's a propaganda campaign against the nuclear power industry perpetrated by the oil industry? I mean, that may sound like a conspiracy theory, but
I've heard that, and I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff, because frankly, why point to conspiracy when just general stupidity usually explains what humans are doing most of the time? I don't know that
I get what you're saying. Well, but certainly there is, if nuclear power and nuclear energy is so much more reliable and so much more efficient and safe and produces more energy with less waste, then surely this would be something our government ought to be in favor of, the citizens ought to be in favor of, unless the oil companies had lobbyists convincing people not to adopt, not to go nuclear, that it's going to be dangerous or harmful or unsafe. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the lobbyists working for the oil companies probably have something to do with why nuclear energy is perceived in such a negative light in this country.
Historically, I think what's happened, like if you talk 70s, 80s, even 90s, maybe before we were all quite so environmentally conscious as we are now, it was a simple matter of, I'm a plant manager at GE, and I'm going to build a new plant, right? And I can build a gas turbine plant, or I can build a nuclear power plant. And so, I start submitting the papers to the government. There's public meetings about, zoning or whatever you got to do to build a new plant. And it doesn't take me long to realize I get way more shit from the public about building a nuclear power plant than I do about building a gas turbine plant. So if I'm going to build a gas turbine plant, there's crickets. If I say I'm going to build a nuclear power plant, I've got every fucking soccer mom in a 50-mile radius standing outside my door with picket signs. And it's that simple. So management goes, I ain't taking the grief for this. This is just too much of a pain in the ass. So it's not necessarily a logical decision. It's what's good PR? What causes me the least amount of grief but gets the job done? And so that has been the thinking for 50 years as far as nuclear power is concerned. They used to think back in the 50s when they were doing the Atoms for Peace program and all of that, people were saying that nuclear power was going to be so cheap that they weren't even going to bother to meter it. You just get it for free. It would be like, the water in your tap. You might pay some flat fee or something, but they're not even going to bother to measure it because it's going to make electricity free. I'm not quite sure why that vision never came to pass, but the people that were saying that probably had good reason to think it at the time. They probably just weren't being wide-eyed and unrealistic in their beliefs. And the only reason nuclear power is expensive now is because of all the regulation that's associated with it.
So when we're comparing prices, our producer Wes asked a question in the chat, and we'll go ahead and bring that up. But he wants to know, with gas prices as high as they are, could nuclear power be an alternative? And he says via electric cars and such. And I'm not sure if nuclear power, I'm not sure how that relates to electric cars. But the point of the question is, could nuclear power be a viable alternative to save money?
It definitely could be. I've gone back and forth on this one as I've looked at the math and whatever. Nuclear power tends to be about, let's say, 12 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. Gasoline, when you talk about putting gasoline in your car engine and burning it to go to work, it's actually very cheap. And you don't usually talk about, even kilowatt hours of power your car generates. You usually talk about horsepower. 1 horsepower is 746 kilowatts. So there's a lot of energy in a gallon of gasoline, and it's cheap. Even at $4 a gallon, it's cheap. That's something I ought to work the math out on. I've never done it, but it would be interesting to figure out what the kilowatt hour cost would be for that. But it's probably right in line with what you pay for your electricity. So if you're trying to cut down on greenhouse gases and you build a bunch of nuclear plants and then you start running electric cars, absolutely. That is something that works in terms of the economics, and it's something that works in terms of saving the environment and helping with the greenhouse problem with global climate change. So yeah, that would work. The other problem with that is when you look at, say, a 100 horsepower car and you start turning that into kilowatts and you start asking, okay, what's the average commute, that kind of thing. It's somewhere around 10,000 kilowatt hours. That's a lot. That's doubling your energy requirements for a household. And the grid can't take it. If suddenly everybody started buying electric cars, even if you had the plants that could produce the electricity, not every house could pull twice the energy every day. So
that's probably what Wes meant when he was linking the electric cars to the nuclear. If we got our electricity via nuclear power, everybody in the world could have an electric car and it wouldn't affect anything, right?
Other than the cost of production, both in terms of economical cost and environmental cost, because there's a lot of environmentally damaging things that go into electric cars, those lithium batteries, that kind of thing. But yeah, once you built it, assuming you could build one that lasts forever in particular, you would reduce your waste considerably.
Yeah, and we also need to consider that, electric cars is a fairly new technology, at least newly available for us average Joes. And the technology, no doubt, is still maturing and will continue to mature so that it becomes more efficient and easier to dispose of. With, there's problems right now, but it doesn't mean it will necessarily be like that forever. If we have the interest in electric vehicles, if demand for them was higher and it was a viable, replacement for combustion gasoline, then it's going to advance, right? We shouldn't expect it to be this way forever.
I was going to do it. I drove a Infiniti G35 for 12 years. I bought it used. And basically the transmission just died one day. It's a great car. I loved it. And I had already decided that when the Infiniti died, I was going to buy a Tesla. I was on the waiting list. It was going to happen. Well, so the Infiniti died all of a sudden. The transmission fell out of it. It didn't literally fall out of it, but you get the point. And the mechanic told me it was going to cost more to fix it than what the car was worth. And it's like, okay, time to buy a new car. The problem is I'm still 3 years down the line on the waiting list for the Tesla. And this was also about the same time that the news was reporting that the quality of the Teslas, the quality control of the Tesla company was not good. And they were having quality problems. And it's like, okay, well, I guess I've got to go. I can't do without a car for the next 3 years. So I guess I'm going to have to go buy a new car. And I could have gotten like a Volt or something, but none of those things really appealed to me. I wanted something sexy. I wanted something that said Dr. Ben. So I ended up getting a 370Z. And it burns gas, but I don't feel too bad about it. I enjoy driving up down the street with it.
And it says Dr. Ben.
Well, I have a license plate on it that says something like that. Yeah.
How do we advance from here? Basically, how do we ensure to Americans that nuclear power is safe, that it's efficient, that it's environmentally safe, in such a way to decrease our reliance on foreign oil? What do you think? What do you think the secret is there? What's the stumbling block, and how do we get past it?
Well, so I had an epiphany earlier when you were talking about T2, and you were talking about how you had nightmares as a kid of nuclear war and that nuclear hellscape. And when I was about the same age, it was Jaws. And I was afraid to go in the goddamn swimming pool because I was afraid some shark was going to, come out of the filter or something and eat me in the swimming pool. I mean, I was afraid to go swimming after Jaws because that's how children think, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is the sharks were almost, I won't say hunted to extinction, but their numbers were vastly reduced after the movie Jaws came out. Fishermen were catching them and killing them, and it was having an impact on the whole ecosystem in the ocean. And there had to be this sort of public campaign, stop killing the damn sharks, okay? They don't eat that many people, leave them alone. Yeah. And so this was not a rational fear, and even the people that call themselves environmentalists would tell you that this wasn't a rational fear and don't do that. So nuclear power is the same deal. You can't say that we can't have nuclear power because you're afraid of it and it makes you uncomfortable. If it makes you uncomfortable, don't do it. Let somebody else do it. Let somebody else run that industry. Go get a job doing something else. But there are competent people that can do the job and do the job well. And how do you get that idea across to the public without a full-fledged campaign, kind of like with the sharks, and, sort of to re-educate people? I don't know. I don't think you can. I think you have to have sort of a concentrated, concerted effort by the government or the power industry or somebody that has, a vested interest in seeing nuclear power make a comeback. And there's nobody like that right now. There's a handful of special interest groups. Nobody large though. Nobody as big as Greenpeace, for example, who go the other way with it.
So Tobin has a question from the chat. He wants to know, I brought up Chernobyl and Fukushima earlier. He says that they are examples of nuclear failures. Is it possible to make it safer to produce energy? And I think we kind of touched on this already, but basically I think what we're looking for is reassurance that this type of thing wouldn't happen in the United States if we employed more nuclear power plants. Is there a way to reassure people?
Absolutely. Those were generation 2 reactors. We are up to generation 5 reactors. The designs have been improved upon greatly over the last 50 years. Chernobyl, that's a discussion in and of itself. We could have a whole podcast just on what went wrong at Chernobyl. But Chernobyl was a CF from the beginning. It was a badly designed reactor.
CF stands for clusterfuck for anyone who doesn't know, but go on.
Yeah, I was trying not to be a potty mouth for once.
Well, it's too late. You already dropped an F-bomb on us earlier, so.
Right. We had DD in there too. You know, but Chernobyl is just so bad. It's just hard to even know, you know, where to start with it. But the big three that everybody brings up, the people that are afraid of nuclear power, is 3 Mile Islands, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. Chernobyl, you have to sort of treat as its own thing, talk about it separately. And again, I even remember in '86, I would have been a junior in college, and I had already decided I was going to be a physics major. And even then, I was old enough to realize that probably drove the nail in the nuclear industry, in the coffin of the nuclear industry from then on. But Chernobyl was an old design. It was a bad design. It was a design that the West had already stopped using. And they continued to do it. And then they ran this test in the middle of the night because they had orders to run this test, whether it was a good idea or not. And that's how everything went south. But 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, here's the funny thing about 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. Nobody died. Nothing really that bad happened in either one of those cases. Fukushima had a partial meltdown, so the reactor itself is sealed off. And they're trying to figure out how to clean that up as safely as they can. But nobody died from the radiation. By the way, Chernobyl, which is the worst nuclear disaster ever, they account maybe to 50 people dying from it now. 26 people died fighting the fire and actually getting that situation under control. And then you have to look at statistics to figure out, you know, the people that still live in the area, how many more of them die from cancer than what the standard rate is, because there's naturally occurring radiation, you know, anywhere on the planet you go. So they have to look at what's significantly significant over the standard rate for cancer rates. And they've decided maybe another 26 people have died from Chernobyl. So there were maybe 50 people that died from the Chernobyl accident.
So that 50 people number, that figure accounts for not only the people who died as a direct result of radiation exposure or in the fire, but also the people who've developed cancer at a higher than expected rate?
Right. Yes. 26 people that died basically during the event, and then another 26 or so people that died based on a slightly higher statistical rate of cancer in the area, which, by the way, you know, everybody thinks that Chernobyl's like this wasteland where nobody lives. There were people that never left Chernobyl. There were farmers that were like, "Hey, this is all the land I own. I'm not going anywhere. I don't care."
There's people there right now. There's people fighting around the area of Chernobyl. Yeah. There's Ukrainians fighting Russians. Yeah,
but there have been people that have actually lived around the Chernobyl reactor that refused to leave, and they lived to ripe old ages. You know, again, that was what, 40 years ago or something. So, you know, most of them have probably died of old age now, but there were people, you know, there were farmers that stayed, you know, the local, you know, the guy that ran the church said, "This is my parish. You know, my people aren't leaving. I'm not leaving." The local store owner that had to sell them feed or whatever for their farms, he said, "I'm not going anywhere." So there was a little micro town, if you will, that hung out, you know, right there around Chernobyl, and most of them never got sick, even after the you know, disaster occurred. So this is really something. This is on par with, to be this afraid of radiation is on par with being afraid to go in the ocean because of sharks. You might get eaten by a shark. It might happen, but the odds are really, really slim.
So Linear brings up a question here. Or this person asks, you know, I'm just wondering if it's possible to have so much waste that it can become a problem unto itself. Can we keep up with the nuclear waste if we were to go entirely nuclear?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think the whole thing about disposing of the waste and why we haven't solved that problem, there's such a thing as a breeder reactor. So nobody's ever said this out loud. I've certainly never heard anybody in the industry say it, but I suspect that there are plant managers that love having that excess waste out back of the plant, because someday it might actually be worth something. They'll put it in a breeder reactor and they'll make it to where they can burn it again and get more power out of it.
Yeah, I've heard about that. That when the nuclear process that we use now doesn't actually use that much of the potential energy of the plutonium.
No,
but in France they do.
Or?
From what I've heard that we don't. But in France, the reason their utilization is so much more widespread is because they recycle their nuclear energy, so they use it over and over again.
Yep. There's only about 3% of the uranium that's fissionable, fissile, as they like to say. And you can make more fissile material out of the uranium-238 in a special kind of breeder reactor. And so you can change the sort of depleted uranium that doesn't do much into fissionable uranium by sort of putting it around the outside of a running reactor. And then you got another core for another reactor. So, and this stuff is, if you're only using 3% of it to begin with, you could probably run this thing. I don't think it's unfair to say you could run this thing through 10, 15, 20 cycles before you even had to worry about disposing of it as waste. And so now suddenly that 3 M&Ms goes down to a quarter of an M&M every year. And just the absolute volume of waste, it's just not that big of a deal compared to the waste we have to deal with from other industries.
Right. I mean, I think there's like whole barges just sitting out there in the middle of the ocean waiting. At least at one point there was. I don't know if that's still an issue, but
what do you mean, of nuclear material?
No, just waste.
Garbage.
The sheer amount of junk, just
what
nobody knows what to do with.
I think that's true. By the way,
I mean, we still use landfills, so
yeah. Here's another story, by the way. Back in the 70s, I'm going to say 75 or so, and my advisor told me this story years ago. I was too young to remember it. But back in 75 or so, we were having this bout of, what about the nuclear waste, blah, blah, blah. And the French said, guys, if you're so goddamn soft about it, sell us your waste or give us your waste and we'll dispose of it for you. And
really,
that's about the time the Greenpeace guys went and talked to Jimmy Carter, then President Jimmy Carter. And that's about the time that Jimmy Carter signed a bill into law that said you cannot transport nuclear waste across the oceans because that might, I don't know, hurt a fish or something. And so you've got these environmentalists who think they're doing the right thing, and they think that, however they get around to getting their cause to work, everything's fair, because it's the right thing to do. So they pushed for a law that literally destroyed the solution that somebody offered us for free. And it's not the only time they've done that. The reason Yucca Mountain didn't work is because Greenpeace convinced the local Native American tribe, that it wasn't in their best interest, even though they'd already sold the rights to the Yucca Mountain plant. And when they realized they couldn't do anything about it legally, they blocked the one road that went to Yucca Mountain. And they said, well, we still own the road, and therefore you can't drive your trucks up and down this road. And so these are the kind of tactics that these people use because they think they're doing the right thing. But that this is the kind of stuff that makes plant owners and people, in power go, it's just not worth it. I'm not putting up with this bullshit.
We have one more question from Kat the Humanist, who wants to know about thorium salt reactors. And I'm not sure if that's something that you can speak to, but that's the first time I've ever heard of that. So do you know what a thorium salt reactor is?
I do. And I don't know. I hear about them a lot. Whenever you get into the nuclear discussion, somebody always wants to bring up the thorium reactors. And they're fine. They're good. They're one of several designs that work and work really well. I think the core thing about the thorium salt reactors that makes everybody so happy to think about it is that you make this salt. It's think of salt like table salt, sodium chloride, right? Except you're using thorium and not sodium. And so it's the salt, but it's got this high melting temperature. So this becomes this liquid that you circulate inside this reactor. So your reactor core is the liquid. And it gives off all this heat, and it burns hotter than a normal reactor, which is handy because the hotter the temperature, the better the engine efficiency. There's some basic physics reasons behind that, which you probably don't want to know. But the other thing that's cool about a thorium reactor is if it gets too hot, they put salt plugs in the bottom that are just a little bit denser, and the plugs will melt. If the thorium salt starts to overheat, they'll melt and they'll open up a hole in the bottom of the container, and it'll go into a big drain pan in the bottom and spread itself out so that it can never go supercritical on you. And you can never have a meltdown in that regard because the reactor shuts itself off. Now, there are other fourth and fifth generation reactors that do that with uranium too. I've seen reactor demonstrations. I personally like the pebble bed reactor, but that's just another option. You can literally I've seen demonstrations where the guy literally walked up to the console, randomly turned all the knobs and walked away, and he could not make the thing melt down.
I think I've seen that too. That was in an episode of The Simpsons where Homer goes to work and he doesn't know what he's doing. Sorry.
Well, see, that's more that culture thing. That's more of, obviously anybody associated with the nuclear industry field is some sort of buffoon that just can't wait to, destroy the environment, right?
So I do have one more question. I know I said that the last one was the last question, but this one is coming from me. When we look at things like wind power and hydroelectric and solar, is nuclear power a better option than those, or is it just something to supplement those sources of power?
I think the problem with wind and solar is, and again, I don't have a problem with going in those directions. I'm not saying all we do is nuclear forever. I'm just saying that today that's what can solve the problem. And you definitely should still be pursuing all of these other technologies at the same time. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just trying to find the best solution for today. But the problem with solar and wind is they're on about a 30% duty cycle. People want to tell you that it's competitive with nuclear power in terms of cost per kilowatt hour and that kind of thing. Sure, it's competitive when it's running and working, which, when the wind's blowing or when the sun's up, whatever, but that only works out to about 30% of the time. So you still have 2/3 of the time that you have to supplement those power sources with something else. And you can say we're going to build these huge battery farms, to store the power for, when we need it at night or when a storm comes through or whatever. But now you're getting into a whole nother environmental catastrophe if you start talking about making battery parks that can store terawatts of power, so that big cities can make it through the night until the sun comes up again. So people want to act like this is a solution and it's all done and it's all, just set. We just have to have the will to do it. It's not that simple. It's with all things. It's never as simple as some people want you to believe. And of course, the other problem that most people don't realize outside of the industry, which, I keep preparing for these talks and I keep coming up with all these little gems that I didn't even know. But most of your real potential for solar and wind is Midwest, Kansas, right? The problem with that is most people live on the coast, East and West Coast. So if you want to go with wind and solar, the first thing you have to do one more time is upgrade the grid and upgrade it significantly, because now you're going to have to transport that electricity thousands of miles from the Midwest, from the breadbasket out to the East Coast where most of us live. And the grid that we have right now is not anywhere close to supporting that kind of energy transfer from point A to point B. So, yeah, sure, you want wind, get on it, but understand that you've got to do other things before it becomes a viable solution 24/7. And that's what most people seem to miss. Or something else I was going to say, but it went right out of my head. I do that a lot. Doesn't matter.
Before we end the show, I do want to give a shout out to all of the people in the chat who tuned in to watch us talk about nuclear power. We've got Linear, who's a patron. We've got producer Wes backstage and producer Kat the Humanist as well. As executive producer, PSF, who is Josh the Archon. We had Tobin, who gave us a question earlier, as well as Aunt Kathy. Appreciate you guys. I hope you guys have learned a little bit about nuclear. Oh, there's KCA Randy too. My bad.
I want to say one more thing. If you're trying to play us out, keyboard cat, I want to say one more thing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Go ahead.
I told you I was going to start a rant if we weren't careful.
Yes.
The other thing about the Ukraine,
Chernobyl.
Well, no, the war
just
Ukraine
Ukraine
right now.
Okay.
Is, Europe is struggling mightily to cut off Russia from its oil exports because they've shut down their economy every other way they can do to punish them for this, justifiably so. But the irony of this is that the Germans, who I normally think of Germans as being very level-headed and pragmatic in their approaches to just about everything, the Germans decided about 10 years back that they were going to go solar and wind, and they were going to just do nothing but green power, and they started shutting down their nuclear plants. Well, one of the things that's happened that most people don't like to talk about is Europe has been in a wind drought for the last year or so. And so they're not getting the kind of power output that they expected to get. And that's a problem all over Europe, but Germany in particular has lost the ability, because they've shut down their old nuclear power plants and most of their coal plants. They've lost the ability to come anywhere close to generating the electricity their people need. And so they routinely have to buy electricity from France and Russia for the most part. So they need Russia for the oil and they need Russia for the electricity. And so this is why they don't want to cut off certain parts of their economy, because Germany shot themselves in the foot. They used to be, energy independent, at least in terms of generating electricity. Cars are different, but they were at least energy independent in terms of generating electricity, and now they can't even do that. And so this is why Germany was reticent to put any more, to stop Russia from invading or to put any more restrictions on them economically, because they can't afford to live without the Russians now because they shut down all their nuclear power plants.
Caleb, you got any more questions?
No, man.
Are you good with nuclear?
I'm good.
Did we go nuclear enough for you?
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't have the graphic of the mushroom cloud, so I kind of shot myself in the foot with that one. Maybe next time we bring Dr. Bitt on so that he can elaborate on nuclear power plants in and around Ukraine. We'll have that.
Tell me beforehand. I'll send you some pictures.
There you go.
Honestly,
it sounds like
we need to change his background or our backgrounds to just mushroom clouds, just constantly going off in the background all the episode, just silent. Obviously we don't need to hear the ruckus, but just nonstop nuclear clouds.
I saw you guys have backgrounds. I went for the nebula. I didn't even think about doing a mushroom cloud. That's bonehead move on my part.
Hindsight is 20/20, but we all know what we're doing the next time. And hopefully, I think we answered Aunt Kathy's question about the benefits. It sounds like the moral of the story is less waste, more energy, green energy, and cheaper if you go with the nuclear option compared to, and the downside, maybe the disadvantages are, I don't know that we really talked about the fact that, according to my theory, you have oil companies lobbying against it, giving it a bad name. And you have, according to Dr. Ben's theory, Greenpeace and
Somebody.
The answer is we have to convince the soccer moms that this is a worthwhile investment because it's clearly equitable.
That's a good one. I like that. I like that.
We do, and we need to target those that are the loudest in opposition. And there's a shite ton of them soccer moms out there, and I'll bet you, if you can convince them, they can make a pretty penny off it at minimum risk. As you say, there's always going to be some risk, but let's be honest, you know, you're better off, not taking the airplane than buying the house 20 miles down the road.
Everybody wants to be St. George and slay the dragon. Everybody wants to save the world and do their bit, to help make the world a better place than it was before they got here. And that's laudable. But, before you start opining about an industry that you don't know anything about, really, maybe talk to some people that are actually in that industry and don't just assume they're all shills that are just trying to fuck them over for the hell of it. I mean, that's Vladimir Putin shit right there. The rest of us don't do that.
Yeah. And of course, your other alternative is to watch Secular Soapbox and other Promethean secular frontier shows where we have people like Dr. Ben Davis on, nuclear physicists, to sort of educate us on nuclear power. So,
by the way, if we get something in the comments or whatever, I'll try to watch that. I've done some calculations. I'm happy to do more if somebody's asking about a particular thing. But I did run the numbers on a wind turbine. It's about 682 pounds of waste, for fiberglass blades and things like that. Over, that 100 years that you might live, that's actually not bad compared to, burning coal or gas or oil or propane, natural gas, whatever they call it. 682 pounds of waste. Again, I couldn't put that in my coffin with me, but that's at least a manageable amount of waste compared to most other industries. So I don't have a problem with wind or solar. I just don't think it's a solution that we can make work straight away.
I like that metric, though. Do you think it could be buried with you, the amount of waste? I think that's a good standard. Like, let's try to condense it down to what you could be buried inside that box with. That's a good goal.
Yeah. It sounds like it's certainly, I think we're all in agreement that these various forms of green energy are more preferable to the fossil fuels that we're burning. And that's kind of really the point. But nuclear power should definitely be reconsidered among, as Caleb says, the soccer moms. So,
and 3 M&Ms, 1 year nuclear waste, 120 gallons of oil, since we were specifically supposed to be talking about oil tonight.
Yeah, we didn't talk directly about oil, but I think we talked about it by proxy. The fact that we went to great lengths to stress.
Yeah,
there's not much to really say about oil.
They're hydrocarbons. They're chemicals. It doesn't really matter whether you're talking about coal or oil or some other type of hydrocarbon like natural gas.
Right.
It's all taking carbon atoms and oxidizing them.
Dr. Ben Davis, thank you for joining us this evening. For any of you guys in the chat who would like to learn more about him, we have a link to his Facebook page in the chat below. I think we may have you have a website as well, don't you?
I do. It's askdrben.org. I don't get a lot of hits on the website. I still seem to get most of my hits on Facebook. Most of my questions come in there, but I try to monitor both.
So check that out if you guys want to hear more about Dr. Ben Davis. And we are very hopeful to maybe have you back on the show where we'll either elaborate on nuclear power or we'll talk some science fiction with you.
Great.
Secular Soapbox is on Wednesdays, normally at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We had to make it a little bit later tonight to accommodate Dr. Ben as he's teaching a class. But you guys can catch us 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Wednesdays. And I would like to thank our patrons, Sunny, Phil, Jenna, and Linear. Don't forget to check out PSF, Patreon, and Facebook pages also in the description, and like this video and subscribe to Promethean Secular Frontier if you're not subscribed already. And for Caleb, Sunny Shell, producer Wes, Kat, Trent, Phil, Jenna, and Josh, I am Bryce Aroni for Team Promethean. We will see you guys in the future.